Okay, good morning. So we're up to Sif Gimel. So Siman Kuf Ayin Dalet Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Im Ein Loi Ela Kais Echad. So if a person only has one cup of wine, Manicha Ad La'acha Hamazon Mevarich Olav. He should leave it until the end of the meal and use it for Birchas Hamazon. So the backdrop is, we said at the beginning of the Siman, that Yayin Shebatoich Suda you make Ber Gofen, and it's not covered by the bread. That was the first halacha. The second halacha was that yayin patters other types of mashkin, and now Sif Gimel is talking about what happens if you only have one glass of wine. Rather than have it during the meal, have it for Birchas Hamazon. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Manichai, Sif Katan Hey, Ta'afilu leman da'am Birchas Hamazon eina tuna kais. Even according to that opinion, which says Birchas Hamazon does not require a kais, Mikal Malka Mitzmin Amuvchi Yesh Bezem Yuchal Alsus B'kais. It's preferred to use a case to bench over, because it'll come on Siman Kuf Pei Beis Sif Aleph, which we'll get there in Mitzvah Hashem. The Lemaisa, the Olam is noeg not to when there's only one person. If there's three, then people do it. But if there's only one person, the minhag seems to be not. Either way, Mikol Malkam Imhud Somi Lishtois. If, however, the person is thirsty, and back in the day, the drink was wine. His somer lishtois ve'ein lo sham mashkin. He hasn't got any other drink. Mutav sheyishta kodim. Don't have to wait for benching. Let him drink it during the meal. Kadei lot says gam das hamordechai. Because that way you can fulfill also the shitta of the Mordechai. What's the Mordechai? Shehuva b'ramah come and siman kuf sam v'schayin. Kuf tzadi zayin. Shesoivet dechashetoiv lishtois ein achayv min atayru levarich birchas hamazon ad sheyishta. That if a person is thirsty to drink at the end of the meal, then according to the Mordechai, he hasn't got a chiyuv min Torah to bench, because he's not v'chalta v'savata, which we'll get to, Mitzvah Hashem. So either way, Sif Gimel says that if he's only got one case, preferably he should leave it till Birchas Hamazon. Okay. Halacha Dalet. Im kava lishtois lifnei hamazon. Now this is quite a motzu shaila. If a person drinks before the meal, he has a glass of wine before the meal, ein tzorich levarich al hayayin shebatoich hamazon. Then he does not need to make a new ber gofen for wine during the meal. The yayin shelifnei hamazon poitra, because the bracha of ber gofen before the meal, even though it's before the meal, it patters any wine during the meal. Now the classic example of this is coming up. V'chein yayin shel Kiddush poiter yayin shebatoich hamazon, which is the classic scenario where it will happen on Friday night, for example. You make Kiddush before you've washed, and therefore that ber pragofen will cover wine that you have during the meal. V'chein hamavdil ala shulchan, you make Havdala Motzei Shabbos at a table. Paita hayayin shebatoich hamazon, and you go straight into Melav Malka. That will exempt any wine you have during Melav Malka. V'yeshomim, however, with Havdala it's not so clear, because v'yeshomim she'ein birchas hayayin Havdala paita elim kain not al yadav kodim Havdala. It will only help you if you actually washed for your Melav Malka before Havdala. Hilkach hamavdil kodim netila yechavin shlo hotziyayin. So therefore, the best thing to do to avoid complications is when you make ber pragofen before you've actually washed for Melav Malka, yechavin shlo hotziyayin. You should actually have in mind that this ber pragofen is going on this glass of wine that I'm using for Havdala, and not other wine that I'm going to have during the meal. V'ayin comes Siman Reish Sadites Sif Zayin. Okay, but the evet shelo kivein kach. If a person didn't have that in mind, at the end of the day, if a guy does go straight from Havdala into Melav Malka, he will not make a new bracha on wine during the Melav Malka. The Sofik brachas to Rabbanan lahakel. Okay, let's do the Mishnah Berurah on that. Sif Katan Vov. So im kava, that means he has a glass of wine before the Suda, that will patter any wine during the meal. Kosva achrein and delav dafka kava, it doesn't have to be he was kover with, which means several glasses. Du adin afilu im b'shasa rak kais echad shel yain kodim hasuda. Even if he has just one cup of wine before the meal, paita yain shebatoich hasuda, that is enough to exempt any ber pragofen during the meal. V'chol zeh im daita lishtos gam batoich hasuda. This is only if you're intending to drink wine during the meal. Shebatoich hamazon, sorry. V'huadin the poita nami yain shela'ach hamazon. It doesn't mean only during the meal, literally when you're eating your food, but sometimes after the meal, before you bench, you want to have a drink of wine. it will exempt that as well. So Shilach HaMazon Kodim Brachas HaMazon. B'Makom Shiragin Nishtas Yain Acha Gemar Chilason. Some places there is a minhag to drink wine after you finished eating. Or that was your intention. Avalim Lo Ha'ilo Yain Lifnei HaMazon. But if you did not have any wine before the meal, or and then, as the halacha is, if you have wine during the meal and that requires its own bracha, then if you have wine after the suda, i.e. before you've benched, but just later you're just sitting after dessert and talking or whatever, and you want some glass of wine, then according to this, we'll see in a second, the halacha is going to change, but you sorech levarich shenis, you will have to make a new bracha for that wine at the end of the meal. Ki yain shebeteicha mazon eina barak lishris hamachal, because what is the purpose of drinking wine during the meal? It's to help the food digest, to help the food go down. Shebemeo ve'eina choshuv lifter hayayin shel acha mazon, and that wine, the bracha on that wine, does not exempt wine after the meal, because the wine after the meal is for a very different function, i.e. shebolish tias letanug. You're doing it for enjoyment. It's not to help the food go down. That if a person is very thirsty because of the food that is eaten, even if it's delayed quite a while after eating, even though he hasn't yet benched, it's considered as if it's wine during the meal, because it all has the same purpose, i.e. it comes to sort of help the food go down, to digest. If he drinks immediately after eating, his stomach it's coming to help the food digest. This is not very prevalent, because in practice we don't sort of stop the meal until Birchas Hamazon, until we actually bench. This is all considered the meal, and therefore it's not really relevant. This. And therefore, where if you make a bracha of bepragofen before the meal or even during the meal, that will cover all wine that you have, whether it's during the meal or at the very end before Birchas Hamazon. If you're sitting around and drinking wine, then you will not need to make a new bracha. And in fact, if you look at 15, he says in the first, even if you delay a long time at the end of the meal, you don't need to make a new bepragofen on wine had at the very end of the meal. Okay, let's carry on. Kiddush, what's the Kiddush? Kamash Melon, don't say dafka yain kodim hamazon dechoshiv. It's only wine which you have. Imagine you've got guests and you serve some wine before the meal and you're talking, and then you have the meal, and then you have wine during the meal. You could argue that type of wine will exempt the wine during the meal. But Kiddush is there for a different purpose, because because the function of wine normally, not for Kiddush, but normally is to open get the gastric juices flowing, right? Kiddush, but the Kiddush wine, to boy karla mitzvah, which is there for the mitzvah of making Kiddush, maybe that should not exempt wine during the meal. Kamash malon de paita. That actually know that wine of Kiddush, even though it's there for the mitzvah, it will exempt any wine you have during the meal. The nearly poshet, and it seems simple to me, to be bedina seinu she'ein on the regilim in our countries, she'ein on the regilim nishos yain b'tei chasuda, where we don't really drink too much wine during the meal, says the Chavetz Chaim. Afilu b'Shabbos, even on Shabbos, ein a poite elim kein hoyadai telzem mitchil. It only exempts if you intended to drink it. K'moshe kosafti mekaydim, and that's why it's probably better if you plan on drinking wine during the meal to actually have it on the table at the time of Kiddush, and that way the Kiddush is definitely going to cover the wine. That's preferred. Yeah, so you've got a nice bottle of Chateau Neuf or whatever it may be on the table. Better to put it on the table on Friday night at the Kiddush, and that way your Kiddush will definitely cover that wine you're going to have. Okay, Shebetei Hamazon, v'hu adin shelach hamazon, and so too, like we said before, after the mazon. V'chein hamavdil, and so too, the first opinion in the Mechaber was the same applies for Havdala. Rotzalema sifkoten yud, the afal gav the Havdala ein shaycha klal l'suda k'mei Kiddush. It's not really shaykh to a suda. You're making Havdala to make Havdala. Afilu hachi kiven the hivdil ala shulchan, since you're doing it at a table. Rotzalema shehechin atzma l'suda, you're getting prepared to have your malav malka. Shaycha l'suda, it's got some sort of connection to the l'suda, Amari kanal shoy b'daita lishtas gam b'toich hasuda. And again, you're talking about where you intend to have some wine during the Malav Malka. She'ein birkas hatam kanal te'ena shaykh l'suda k'mei Kiddush. But there is another opinion which says that drinking Havdala, the Ber Pragofen Havdala, will not cover the wine during the Malav Malka. Why? Because the reason is te'ena shaykh l'suda k'mei Kiddush, because it's not really shaykh to the meal like Kiddush is. She'ein ela b'mokum suda, because Kiddush is more shaykh to the Suda. Why? Because there is a rule, Kiddush has to be b'mokum Suda. Therefore, this opinion, the second opinion says, to show that this Ber Pragofen is part of the meal, you have to have washed your hands before Havdala. Because therefore, that's demonstrating that this is the beginning of the meal. Yain Havdala, Kosa Mogan Avram, the Dafka Yain Havdala She'ena Bolet Tzorech Suda. Dafka wine, which is not a tzorech suda, but generally if you drink a glass of wine before you eat, and it's going to sort of get the gastric juices flowing and opens up the digestive system, that exempts wine b'toich suda. That dafka he was soisim in his dafka is dachal after natila that you make your bepragofen. Not al yadov. Now, this is a bit confusing because you wash your hands before Havdalah. Lav dafka. Even if you just make Havdalah, but you're just ready to go, the table's laid and you're ready to eat, you don't actually have to wash your hands beforehand. And the Rabbi argues and says, no, that you actually have to have washed beforehand. Now, Kedim Havdalah. So you wash your hands before Havdalah. Now, so it says the Mishnah, hang on a second. Really, we know you wash until it's Sudayim. You can't be mafsik, you've got to go straight into Hamoitzi. So how can you be mafsik by making Havdalah in between? Yesh loymar, d'lo havi hesach hadas, kivin shadai telechel. It's not really a hesach hadas because your intention is to eat straight away. Ve'ein reshai lechel b'li Havdalah. And you can't eat before you've made Havdalah. So therefore this Havdalah is not a hefsek because it's facilitating you to eat. Hang on a second. But stam to drink between the Tilas Yadayim and Hamoitzi, that you shouldn't do. The whole hetzah here is for Havdalah because it's facilitating, it's giving you permission to eat. Yeah.
You have those every Friday night, those who make Kiddush, who wash before Kiddush.
Right, I was thinking that. Because that's a tzorich of the Suda. For the Yekish Minhag, that's a tzorich of the Suda. Yeah, Inochanami. Yeah. But it's the concept. Yeah. Okay, we've got time to do hey. Let's just finish off. Sif hey. Kol mashe shoyse b'toich hasuda dailo bebrocha achas. Generally speaking, you make one ber pragofen either before the meal or during the meal, and that will exempt all ber pragofens that any further cups of wine that you have during the meal. El imkain. Unless when you have a glass of wine, you say, right, I'm having one glass of wine, this ber pragofen is for this glass of wine, I'm not going to have any more. And then, half an hour later, you fancy another glass of wine, so then you'll need to make a new ber pragofen according to this. It's only if it's if you intend to cover all glasses of wine during the meal, or you really weren't thinking about how many glasses of wine you're going to have. V'chein, says the Ramah, Misha Bola Suda, someone who is a guest at a meal, or he just arrives at a place to eat, and he's offered several glasses of wine. He makes a bracha on each glass of wine, because after each glass it's as if I've decided no more wine. And then they give me a new glass. Well, I'm not in control here, and therefore I make a new bracha. You make a bracha on the ber pragofen at the end of a chasna or the end of sheva brachas, whatever it is, and people drink from the koshel bracha. You don't know exactly who's going to get it. Kol echad tzarich levarich, because you didn't have in mind to be motzi them, and therefore each person who receives the wine should make a ber pragofen to mikri nimlach. We'll see the halacha lemais in a second. Let's just see the Mishnah Berurah. Sif Kotten Tez Zayin. B'toich hasuda. So one glass, one ber pragofen, b'toich hasuda will cover all wine during the meal. Ratzalema afilu shlema basachas, even if you don't drink it in one session. But bracha achas, the mistama, why? Because the normal situation would be kasheberech ber pragofen al kois hoechad, when you make one ber pragofen on your glass of wine, So that's the default, that's the normal situation. You make a ber pragofen during the meal, that will cover any other ber pragofen or any other glass drinking of wine during that meal. However, if you only had intention to drink one glass of wine, then it would be different. If you only intended to drink one glass of wine, and then you change your mind to have more, then it would be different. And the same is true with eating. It's a very interesting halacha. A person bought himself a roll. So the guy went and washed, he made hamoitzi on one roll, and he decided, I'm a bit hungry still, so he sent someone out to buy another roll. Amazing. You've got to make a new hamoitzi because your first hamoitzi was only on the first roll. That because you bought one loaf of bread or one little roll, you ate it, and your hamoitzi was only on that. Because haraya, if you would have intended at the outset to have a second roll, you would have bought one. Later you decided to eat more. However, if you've got a loaf of bread at home, you cut a slice, you made hamoitzi and ate the slice, that's different. The derech adam kenu, that's just the way of life. As I intended, he thought maybe one slice will be enough. You will buy, you'll buy more. You'll buy more. So if that strange scenario that you have, you intend to eat one roll and then you change your mind to have a second one, that would require a new hamoitzi. You're not in the invite list, you just happen to show up at a place and then they give you a second, a third, a fourth glass of wine, and you just happen to show up there. After each glass it's like nimlach, and therefore it requires a new bracha on each time. I.e. they give him, they proffer him a new glass of wine on subsequent occasions. Al kol kais birchas nesuin. Sheyesh sham harbe mesumim v'chol kiyetziboy. Kol echad tzarich levarich. Each person who drinks from the kosher bracha should make a ber bragofen. The mistoma eina mechaven lot says for birchas hamavarich, because the person who made the ber bragofen, the mistoma did not have in mind ma'achar she'enu yodeh im yagia loy. V'ayin lekamon simen kuf tzadi magen avram sif kotzen zayin of Mishnah Berurah Sham. Two very quick points. 25. Important point. Uvizmanenu says the Orach HaShulchan nowadays. The minhag is, we've all been to Shevrachs, we've seen it. The person who makes the ber bragofen, he has in mind whoever's like around him, and therefore because the Maisa, the guy who made the ber bragofen, he intended to include the chevra who are around him, and then you give everyone a bit of the kosher bracha. They do not need to make if the kai had Bistoma had it in mind, and the individuals had it in mind. If you didn't have it in mind, then you make a ber bragofen. That's point number one. Point number two. I don't think I've once heard. I've never seen this in person, but it's a very interesting thing. Rabbi Hartman told me he was once at a chuppah and he saw, you make a ber bragofen, and the chosen. What's the first thing that happens after the chuppah is finished? He breaks the case, the music goes, everyone starts hugging each other. He saw the chosen. The first thing he did after the chuppah, he sat down and he made an ala gefen. Now that I've never seen before. You never see it because Mistoma you only have a little sip. But obviously the guy had more than a little sip. He had a share of ala gefen, a revius, whatever. And he sat down and he made an ala gefen. That is a mindful chuppah, a mindful chosen. Say that.